He thought it was just another quiet morning in the savannah, until a tiny white lion cub limped toward him, trembling, desperate, and crying for help. No wild animal had ever done this before. But when the cub looked into his eyes, everything changed, beginning an unbelievable journey neither of them expected. The sun had barely risen when Daniel stepped out of his jeep, expecting another quiet morning in the vast African savannah. The air was still, the ground warm beneath his boots, and nothing hinted that his life was about to take a turn he would never forget. He walked a few steps toward a patch of dry grass when a faint broken sound reached his ears, a tiny whimper, trembling like a cry swallowed by fear. Daniel stopped. Lions didn't make sounds like that. Not unless something was terribly wrong. He scanned the landscape, and then he saw it. A small, snow-white shape stumbling toward him. A baby lion, no bigger than a house cat, dragging one paw, its fur dusty, its ribs showing with every shaky breath. But what froze Daniel in place wasn't its rare white color, it was its eyes. Those pale blue eyes locked onto him, wide with desperation. And then, to his disbelief, the tiny cub limped closer, looked up at him, and let out a soft cry. As if asking, begging, for help. Daniel's heart pounded. In that moment, instinct battled fear. Approach a wild lion? Or walk away? He took a breath, and stepped forward. Daniel knelt slowly, trying not to startle the fragile creature. The white cub wobbled toward him again, its tiny legs trembling, its breath shallow. Up close, Daniel could see the truth. This cub hadn't eaten properly for days. Its mouth was dry, its fur matted, and its injured paw shook every time it tried to stand. Then the cub suddenly froze. Its ears twitched. A low rumbling growl drifted through the air. Daniel looked up, and his stomach dropped. From behind a patch of thorn bushes, four hyenas emerged, eyes locked on the helpless cub. Their hungry stares, the way they spread out, the slow, confident steps, they weren't just scouting. They had been tracking the cub for a long time. The white cub tried to act brave, baring its tiny teeth as it let out a shaky squeak of a roar. But the hyenas only drew closer, jaws open, saliva glistening in the sun. Without thinking, Daniel stepped between them, arms wide, shouting at the top of his lungs. The hyenas hesitated, circling, confused by this unexpected challenger. The cub, trembling, pressed its head against Daniel's boot, seeking safety where it shouldn't have found any. Daniel's heart raced. He knew this wasn't over. But he wasn't leaving the cub behind. Daniel didn't waste another second. The hyenas were still lingering, pacing in wide circles, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. He bent down, scooped the cub into his arms, and felt just how light it truly was, far too light for a lion its age. The cub didn't resist. Instead, it buried its face into his chest, letting out a weak, broken whimper. "Hang on, little one," Daniel whispered, tightening his grip as he backed toward his jeep. The engine roared to life just as the hyenas made another cautious advance, but the noise kept them at bay. Dust kicked up behind the tires as Daniel sped toward his camp, every bump making him fear the cub might slip from consciousness. When he reached the camp, he gently laid the cub on a blanket. Its breathing was shallow, its tiny body shaking from exhaustion. Daniel grabbed a small bottle, filled it with diluted milk, and tried feeding it drop by drop. At first, the cub couldn't swallow, but then slowly, desperately, it began to drink. He cleaned the injured paw, removed thorns, and wiped away dirt carefully, like tending to a child. Bit by bit, the cub's eyes began to soften. As Daniel worked, memories surfaced, his father teaching him that every life, no matter how small, was worth saving. Now, holding this helpless creature, Daniel finally understood why. By the next morning, the cub was already showing signs of trust Daniel never expected. When Daniel stepped out of his tent, the tiny white lion tried to stand, wobbling on unsteady legs, and followed him with a soft, determined mew. It stayed close, sometimes too close, tripping over his boots, brushing against his leg like a house kitten instead of a wild predator. Daniel couldn't help but smile. "Careful, little warrior," he whispered. Throughout the day, he fed the cub small meals, helped it drink water, and encouraged it to walk a few steps at a time. Each attempt was shaky, but the cub tried with an incredible stubbornness, as if it wanted to prove it deserved this second chance. Moments of innocence filled the camp. The cub pounced clumsily on Daniel's shoelaces, tumbled into his lap while trying to climb a log. And when it grew tired, it curled up beside his boots, breathing softly, trusting completely. Yet each moment also tightened a knot inside Daniel's chest. He knew this bond wasn't meant to last. A wild lion belonged to the wild, not to him. That evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the cub let out its first tiny determined roar. Not strong, but full of hope. 3 days later, Daniel heard the distant rumble of a vehicle approaching his camp. Dust rose in the air as a wildlife rescue truck stopped beside his jeep. 2 officers stepped out, their uniforms marked with the emblem of the Conservation Authority. "Is this where the distressed lion cub was reported?" one asked. Daniel nodded silently and gestured toward the shade where the white cub rested. The officer's eyes widened. A white lion. Extremely rare. It needs specialized care. Daniel already knew what came next. But hearing it felt like a punch to the chest. As the officers prepared a small transport crate lined with soft blankets, the cub limped over to Daniel and pressed its head against his leg. It sensed something was wrong. Its tiny claws gripped his pants, refusing to let go. Daniel knelt, cupping the cub's face gently. "You're going to be safe," he whispered, though his voice trembled. When the officers lifted the cub, it squirmed whining, stretching its paw toward Daniel desperately. The sound cut deeper than Daniel expected. He followed them to the truck, watching helplessly as the crate door closed. Before the engine started, he placed his hand near the bars. The cub touched it with its paw, one last time. Months passed, but not a single day went by without Daniel thinking about the little white cub. He often wondered if it was growing stronger, if it remembered him, or if life at the sanctuary had erased the fragile bond they once shared. One cool morning, he finally decided to visit. When Daniel stepped through the sanctuary gates, a caretaker greeted him with a smile. "You came for the white lion? Follow me." They walked past open fields and rehabilitation enclosures until they reached a wide grassy area bathed in warm sunlight. "He's healthier than ever," the caretaker said. "But there's something you should see." Daniel approached the fence quietly. The cub, now bigger, stronger, its coat shimmering like snow, was lying under a tree. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the cub lifted its head. Its blue eyes widened. And with a sudden burst of energy, it sprinted across the enclosure, skidding to a stop right in front of him. A soft, joyful roar escaped its throat. It pressed its head against the fence, tail flipping wildly, as if every moment apart had been counted. Daniel laughed through a flood of emotion, placing his hand against its cheek just like before. Weeks later, release day arrived. Daniel stood at the edge of the savannah as the gate opened. The young lion stepped out, paused, and turned back, holding Daniel's gaze for one long, unforgettable moment, before running free into the wild, stronger than destiny ever intended. Their journey had ended, but its impact would last forever.